Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Buckland. I'm the Communications Manager for BCS Berkshire branch. And it's my pleasure to welcome on behalf of the committee, Chiara Rustici for our AGM keynote talk, where the topic will be World War III is Cybrid War. Started already, but never declared. So an interesting and provocative title. Chiara is somebody that I know from the communications working group at the BCS. She is an independent GDPR and EU privacy analyst, and she has been a teaching fellow in the University of Genoa and a research scholar at the Universities of Milan and Edinburgh. She's written extensively on how businesses should prepare for GDPR. Her articles have been published both in trade and academic journals such as Computer Law Review International, Journal of Data Protection and Privacy, Bloomsbury, O'Reilly, Computer Weekly, and other publications. She's been instrumental in launching a GDPR Article 40 Code of Conduct initiative at the Duke University Centre for Judicial Studies, and in organising a series of in-depth GDPR workshops at the BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT. Chiara, it's great to have you with us, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Mike. Thank you for the invitation, Andrew. And thank you everybody for having me here at the AGM. Can you hear me? Can you hear me loud and clear, or do you want me to speak a bit louder? Everything fine?
I'd perhaps just suggest that people switch videos off while you're talking, Chiara, so that you're okay for bandwidth.
That's fine, thank you. I've prepared a no slides talk. I'm trying to make it as engaging as possible. There will be references. If you really feel passionate about this topic, please reach out to me via LinkedIn, and I'll send you both reading material and a few notes from this. But it is very much work in progress. I am sort of putting my own thoughts together on this space because it's both fascinating and very, very alarming. I come to this from the perspective of an international law scholar, as well as looking at data protection. I have always been teaching and researching international law. And in one way, the two things really overlap in the increased frequency of cyber incidents we are witnessing. And there is a pattern that is very alarming and demands our attention, both as information technology professional, as data protection professionals, and also individuals who are interested in what's going on. I'll cut to the chase. Cybrid warfare is a newish term. It has emerged over the last 2 years. I wouldn't have seen it, I wouldn't have encountered that term before in the international law literature or in the law of war or military doctrine. But it is pretty much gaining traction. I suppose you could call it in other ways. You could call it hybrid threats or gray zone or hybrid warfare. But cybrid warfare really is the notion that integrates the traditional doctrine of compound warfare, which is when you have warfare on more than one domain, with the X, the unknown quantity, the emerging threats that are undefined, that are below the threshold of armed conflict or outright aggression, and are non-attributable in nature, meaning it's very, very hard to know where they come from, who the sponsor is. Is this a state or is it a non-state actor? So these three elements, they're undefined, we don't know what they are, it's an X, it's an unknown quantity. They're below the threshold of armed conflict and we don't know where they come from. So when you integrate the 5 traditional domains of warfare, which is land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. Don't forget that cyberspace has been declared, formally declared by NATO a domain of military operation in 2016. So that is also very recent. But if you add on top of these the unknown quantity, the something else, then you're moving in cybrid warfare territory. So what characterizes cybrid warfare? We said it's something beyond or simultaneous to attacks on land, sea, airspace, and cyberspace. It's perhaps weaponization of information systems, deepfakes, disinformation on social networks. It's weaponization of laws and democratic institutions against the states who adhere, who stand by those laws and democratic institutions. So turning, for example, human rights laws against democratic states who defend human rights, who uphold human rights. This is normally referred to as lawfare, law and warfare blended together. So weaponization of laws and democratic institutional processes. The erosion, this is another element of cybrid warfare, the erosion of that boundary between espionage, which is intelligence activities, and criminal online operations. So think, for example, of ransomware. Ransomware criminals opportunistically lock your information files for ransomware. But at the same time, they could also connect with nation states known to be hostile to the target and could double their money, so to speak, by selling that exfiltrated data to the hostile state. So this is espionage and criminal online operation blended into one. So it's a very opportunistic use of criminal activities online. Don't forget biological warfare and associated disruption of healthcare critical infrastructure. And we've seen a lot of that in the last 18 months. And generally, cybrid warfare has focused on AI-supported or AI-enhanced technologies, autonomous systems, and anything that could have a dual use. So once you have all this together, you start moving in cybrid warfare territory. The point is, what changes? What's different in cybrid warfare compared to traditional warfare? So I'll work my way through about 10 issues, 10 points, and I hope not to tax your patience too much. Somebody speak up if I'm boring you to death. But anyway, first of all, we have this with cyber activities, and we have this even more with cybrid activities. They do not fit neatly into the category of armed attack. And therefore, they do not justify in law the use of force for self-defense, which is the only case in international law when you could use force to resolve a dispute or self-defense. It is very difficult in cyber and cybrid warfare or hostilities. Let's start with hostilities, to ascertain exactly what harm, injury, death to individuals, damage to property, to infrastructure, what harm has resulted from that operation of cyber or cybrid activity. That is the point. We don't always know what exactly the damage is, the extent of the damage. So cybrid weapons change the rules of detection, knowing what's happening, defense, how do we protect ourselves from them, and deterrence. Why do they change detection, defense, and deterrence? Firstly, they challenge a very important distinction in international humanitarian law, which is the law that applies once a war has been declared or a state of conflict has been declared between civilian and military actors, civilian and military targets, civilian and military methods. Because we don't have that clear-cut tipping point when a state of war has been declared, we're discussing activities below the threshold of armed conflict. We cannot apply the classical distinction that enters, that kicks in once war has been declared, of a distinction between civilian and military. So this is a big challenge. Cybrid hostilities alter the balance of power between nation states and also within and across state actors. Think of big tech. The power has really shifted there. They democratize, so to speak. In other terms, they lower the entry barrier to the use of force to non-state actors, for non-state actors, because in the current commercial sort of network of real-time connectivity we all live in, anyone can deploy very easily commercially available tools that can inflict damage on military battlefield, on civilian population, on political infrastructure. And the other observation that's really important to notice is that because they do no longer originate from the industrial military complex, from the traditional military R&D budgets and programs, but they emerge in unforeseeable ways from the tech startup ecosystem, for example, and are hard to predict from the start. It's hard to tell when an innovation is so successful that it acquires millions of users, that it acquires a network effect, and it's weaponizable precisely because it has a quiet network effect. You know that with hindsight, but it's very difficult from a tech startup ecosystem of thousands of innovators, which one you really need to focus on because it poses a threat. So cybrid hostilities really do have challenging in detection. We don't know where to look for them. That's the point. I mentioned the importance of the distinction between a state of war and a state of hostilities below the threshold of armed conflict. And one of the things to notice is that there is a lot of tactical advantage. There's a great benefit in nation states and non-state actors in using cyber and cybrid activities below the level of an armed attack. They're comparatively low cost, low risk, high impact. They're difficult to detect, as we know. They're difficult to deter, we'll see why, and they're difficult to defend against. And they can be used via proxies, by third parties. So any actor engaging using these cyber and cybrid weapons has a way of externalizing the reputational cost of warfare, if you see, and lowering the public accountability. Parliamentary scrutiny is not there. It's just a different game, and it's a much easier game. So let's go back to detection and attribution, which are key elements of traditional military doctrine. I don't have to tell you that attributing a cyber attack or even malicious cyber activity is very rarely 100% conclusive. You know, we don't need to spend time on that. You teach me, you tell me that spoofing, false flags, deception techniques make it really, really hard. And even knowing the true location of the originating server or machine, it's not the same as knowing the ultimate instigator of that attack. And knowing who to attribute that cyber hostility is ultimately a matter for political judgment. So let's look at whether or not it makes tactical sense to attribute cyber and cybrid hostilities to a particular state or non-state actor. There's a conundrum there. This is not a conundrum that's unique to cybrid hostilities, but it makes it harder to sidestep. It generates very different dynamics. So for example, let's start with a cyber activity. You need forensic detection techniques. You need intelligence to tell you who the likely perpetrators or instigators are. But if you reveal your forensic techniques and sources, of course, you diminish, you wipe out the value to you of those sources for the future. You expose your own vulnerabilities. You put yourself in a position where retribution is now almost so compelling that if you don't engage in retribution, you lose face. So if you don't materially inflict visible damage to the aggression that you have, pointed in your attribution, you end up in a much weaker position than you were before making that public attribution of a cyber incident, for example. If, for example, on the other hand, you decide to make an attribution, but you do not reveal your evidence for the basis of your attribution, it's very, very hard to have support by the international community, is very, very hard to be believed, plausible deniability is there. So in tactical military terms, there's very little advantage in making public attributions of cyber attacks. There's a much greater advantage in labeling these as mere cyber outages, cyber incidents, data breaches, while you consider your other options. So I think that, at least for me, is a great explanation of what is happening and why there's such a reluctance to engage, to explain the current engagement among states and non-state actors as direct cyber attacks, and why the language remains a language of incidents or outages. Even if there were, in other words, there would be no tactical military advantage in declaring and attributing them to known enemies. So this is the attribution conundrum. Now, let's look at retaliation. That's also another, the dynamic there is very different. Let's say you're wondering, as I'm wondering, surely there must be retaliation going on. Surely if members of a NATO alliance are attacked, the alliance is responding. Retaliation in kind, so intra-domain, so cyber retaliation to cyber attacks is complicated, as you know very well, by the nature of cyberspaces, mostly privately owned, privately operated. The risk of unintended consequences is huge, collateral damage, miscalculation, escalation. And cyber weapons or cyber effects are one-shot weapons. You launch it and that's it. You've lost it. So you can't control the output. It's not reusable. They can be reversed engineered, repurposed and used against you. And in many ways, if you intend to use retaliation in cyberspace as a result of an attack to you first, you are necessarily making decisions on the basis of compromised environments. So in-kind, intra-domain retaliation is also tactically not particularly advantageous. Let's look at traditional arms control. We could try to put a stop to these hostilities with an international treaty. Could we really? Because, of course, we know cyber tools are ubiquitous. They're dual use in nature from the start. Inspection is pointless. Verification is impossible. Compliance is very hard to enforce. Cyber assets can be recreated. So arms control treaties are not going to work, neither with cyber weapons, let alone with cybrid weapons. Let's look at deterrence. What's changing in our theory of deterrence? Let's look, for example, by comparison with the last big deterrence era, which was the nuclear deterrence strategy. Cyberspace deterrence is antithetical, it's completely the opposite of nuclear deterrence. Remember nuclear deterrence? It was all about display. It was all about visible nuclear weapons being paraded on the Kremlin Square or on National Day. And it was based on display, on full knowledge of the amount of weapons that the other party had, that the other side had, and on mutually understood logic of mutually assured destruction. So the way deterrence worked in the nuclear age, I don't have to repeat it, is because both parties knew that there was no after. As long as you knew that the other had the same capability of responding to a first strike, you knew that it wasn't in your interest to launch a nuclear attack. So the key knowledge was visibility and quantity of nuclear weapons, knowledge of the mutually assured destruction dynamics. In cyberspace, quite the opposite is the case. You have greater advantage in not displaying your cyber offensive weapons, in not declaring explicitly what amounts to a red line. So the button on the first strike, you don't know what the first strike is. You don't define the first strike. That is a greater advantage in deterrence than declaring what a first strike would be. And by not outlining clearly the retaliation mechanism. So there is no equivalent of the mutually assured destruction. We don't know. So what we do know is that cyber weapons are most effective when they're used by proxies, by third parties on your behalf. They're deployed constantly, not a one-off, but they're there in the background. They're deployed below the threshold of armed conflict, as we know. They're used for signaling wider capabilities, and they're used for signaling knowledge of the opponent's vulnerabilities. That's when they're most effective. They're most effective when they're combined with open source warfare. Open source warfare is a term that refers to information that's out there, so social networks, information freely available. So the most cybrid weapons are most effective when they're combined to create manipulable audience effects. They're most effective when they're deniable, plausibly deniable before the international community. Remember, warheads, you can't deny warheads, you parade them. So it's entirely the opposite. And they're most effective when they're invisible domestically. They don't belong to the political discourse. They don't belong to parliament. They don't undergo parliamentary scrutiny. That's their strength. So they're politically discreet. They can get approval without, as we say, the same level of accountability that you would have to consider when deploying troops. So deterrence really is different. And we don't quite know. The more I read military doctrine, we know what works in cybrid weapons. We don't know what doesn't, what stops it. We don't know how deterrence works. Resilience is a big one. Resilience is a big strategy. And you will have noticed every single nation state has got a cyber resilience plan. So there's a sort of a triple strategy. On the one hand, strengthening resilience so that you neutralize the effects of cyber attacks. You craft careful attributions if and when it is opportune politically, but not necessarily every time you know what the origin, who the attacker or the aggressor is. Just carefully manage the communication around attribution. And retribution in different domains, non-cyber domains. So these are three things that you start to read in military doctrine, in military scholarship. But frankly, it's very, very hard to know what works as a deterrent. One of the things that sort of military scholarship is doing is trying to see patterns in cyber and cybrid. So once you know the patterns, you can perhaps prepare a defense strategy. So let's make a distinction between opportunistic cybercrime and advanced persistent threat. Advanced persistent threat is an interesting concept because it doesn't tie you to seeing it as coming necessarily from a nation state. It could be a non-nation state, it could be a group, it could be a terrorist group operating for a nation state, operating on behalf of a nation state, or not at all, simply operating within a nation state that tolerates its presence. So advanced persistent threat is a good concept to hold on to. But if you manage to categorize key templates, key patterns for these advanced persistent threats, you can start to slowly prepare your defenses. One of the difficulties that the military establishment has with cybrid warfare activities is that whereas states have the legal monopoly of the use of force, and that's just the way states have emerged across the years, they reserve for themselves the use of force. They do not have the legal monopoly of the use of code, and that's a very, very basic distinction. And governance in cyberspace, of course, does not map onto nation states relations, doesn't map onto national boundaries, let alone onto military alliances. Just think at how many international governance institutions cyberspace is under. You have WIPO for intellectual property of digital asset, the IP is controlled by norms set by WIPO. You have the WTO, the World Trade Organization, for digital trade. You have ICANN for IP numbers. And then you have the various many national privacy or data protection regimes, GDPR, but now China, that all pretend to project extraterritoriality, have extraterritorial effect, that regulate data flows. So this is one of the obstacles to having a unified, if you want, doctrine of how to counter cyber and cyber threats for military doctrine. But let's go back to the templates. Let's go back to the actors, advanced persistent threats, and let's understand a distinction. One thing is to have what we could call opportunistic cybercrime group. They opportunistically seek information for financial gain or other gain, And I'm given to understand that, for example, the latest Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack was one of those. And quite another is talk of advanced persistent threat. That is an actor that has the full spectrum of intelligent gathering capabilities and techniques, that is pursuing specific objectives, not just opportunistic gains, and that is guided by a clear intent, plan, and capability, and it's executing attacks through coordination of human actions of a group. So once we have that in mind, we can look at who the main ATPs, advanced persistent threats, are at the moment in cybrid and cyber warfare. You may have heard of these, and please stop me if I'm boring you to death, but they're APT28, Fancy Bear, Russia-based, Cozy Bear, ATP29. These are things that, you know, I'm learning myself. Sandworm. What characterizes these Russia-based advanced persistent threats is that they tend to act geopolitically. They have a disruptive intent, and they combine opportunistic and tailored campaigns. You may recall they compromised the network of the World Anti-Doping Agency. They compromised the network of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. They launched the NotPetya supply chain attack in 2017. I remember it was a big thing even for privacy, data protection officers and privacy people. They engage in a large-scale misinformation campaign through social media on the US election and presumably other elections and other referendums. So what characterizes this cluster of advanced persistent threats? They're Russia-based, but the relationship with the Internet Research Agency is unclear. They are not necessarily taking instructions from, we don't know, from the Russian government. We know they operate in Russia, but not against Russia. But they operate against Western interests. The characteristic is that they blur the boundaries between economic, political, and security data exploitation, theft, and espionage. So one of the characteristic features of their modus operandi is that their supply chain attacks, and the SolarWinds hacks was attributed to Nobelius, which was a group backed by the Foreign Intelligence Service in Russia. That was, again, a group backed by the Foreign Intelligence Service. So an arm's length operation there. Is that they seamlessly move between political targets and civilian and economic infrastructure. The other advanced persistent threat cluster comes from China, the nickname pandas, and they characteristically focus on cyber espionage, focused on commercial gain, intellectual property theft, asset acquisition, and network control. Now they are becoming very present on the international narrative, control the international narrative and public opinion. For example, on COVID-19 outbreak, they're much more outspoken on this front. That were not doing that before. But they are overtly aiming for comprehensive technological superiority. So there is a recognizable sort of strategy there, which involves close cooperation and coordination between state authorities and private players. The North Korea Advanced Persistent Threat ATP Group 38, called Lazarus, engages mostly in criminal operations designed to extract financial value from the targets that flows into the regime. And I think you may recall the SWIFT bank theft, bank heist of 2016 was attributed to them, and the WannaCry ransomware of 2017 was also attributed to them. Lastly, Iran's Advanced Persistent Threat is also interesting because it was Iran was first the victim, as we know very well, of Stuxnet, and later it turned aggressor. And we know that attribution has been suggested for the Saudi Aramco attack in 2012 on this Iran cluster, and the Sands Casino in Las Vegas 2014 distributed denial of service attack. So that is templates of operation. You can start to work around those, but where does that leave the civilian? Where does that leave me, a data, anybody working with data, anybody working with data breaches, anybody working in the civilian sector and in charge of networks? What should you do? And I'm going to briefly touch upon the difference between international law of war and international law in war, but essentially what I'm talking about is about hackback. And the bottom line is, don't do hackback. It's complicated, and it's if there's one message, is that whatever you think your capabilities are in foiling a cyber attack and responding to it, you are moving in international law territory, and you are moving in a space where what constitutes an act of aggression, and therefore what flips the switch between a state of non-war, state of hostilities below the threshold of war, and a state of war, could be anything. So that is a very important sort of difficulty, and something that is very, very typical of our age. We don't know what that first strike can look like. So because, as we know, a lot is going on below the threshold of public attribution, but we also know that there is no tactical advantage of making attribution, of crying foul, of saying, I know you did it and I'm going to retaliate. Because of that, it's fundamentally important that no opportunity is given to anybody to say, that was an act of aggression, so now we're going to retaliate. So hackback is one of those absolute no-nos in this context, especially in the hands of specialists that know exactly what they are doing and could be doing. There is an absolute abyss between declaring a state of war and not declaring a state of war. and you should never underestimate how little it can take to flip. So just to give you a brief sort of crash background course, international law of war is the law that applies among nation states in the use of force and in limiting the use of force to self-defense. Essentially, there are lots of ways in which international law believes state could resolve their disputes. There are a number of arbitration procedures. There are a number of stages you go through in resolving international dispute. The use of force is never allowed in the resolution of disputes among states. The use of force is only and exclusively allowed for self-defense. Self-defense is constructed very narrowly, and it's intended to prevent an imminent attack. And imminent means that the threat is instant, is overwhelming, it leaves no choice of means, no moment of deliberation. So in theory, the use of force in self-defense is absolutely limited to very, very narrow situations. And as I've described all, from what I've described so far, from all the things we've said, you know that preemptive self-defense really cannot apply to cyber or cybrid activities. Detection is difficult, attribution is difficult, proportionality is impossible to measure because things can get out of hand. So the state of the law of war is really designed to make resolution of disputes through absolutely every other possible mean. What you also have is the law that applies once war has been declared. And there is a set of norms that goes from treatment of prisoners, distinguishing between civilian and military. But it does presuppose that a state of international or non-international, sort of local, regional armed conflict has been declared. It does presuppose that. So in a way, the price we're paying, for example, of accepting the blurred boundaries between civilian and military, in short, is worth paying. It's worth knowing that no war has been declared. It's worth staying this side of the flip and accept a level of boundary blurring rather than enter into a state of war. So when people ask me, but doesn't international law prevent all this? Don't we have laws of conduct in hostilities? And the answer is yes, we do, but you have to declare an armed conflict to have started. And then you can apply all those lovely, beautiful distinctions between civilian and military. But is it not best to keep that moment as far as possible? So the answer to my title, the provocative title, World War III will be cyber warfare. Yes, I stand by that. Has it already started but never been declared? I think you know the answer by now. What we have is undoubtedly a level of cyber hostilities and cybrid hostilities, which are challenging all of our constructs, which are challenging all of our legal concepts. But we really don't want it to be declared. We really want to keep that level of uncertainty about red lines. They're tactically important to maintain peace. However, and this is also true for me as a professional, and I believe for a lot of you, it's undeniable that we are in a state of heightened conflict and cybrid conflict at that. So I'll close here. I hope I haven't bored you, and I'll look forward to having a bit of a conversation, because I will have all the answers. I'm pretty sure your questions will be much more interesting than my answers.
Chiara, thank you very much. I think what we'll do is, if you would like to say something, if you can raise a hand, I guess we can see that, and either that or switch your video on. It'd be good to put your video on if you're talking anyway, just to be nice of a Chiara to see you. So do we have any questions? If you can't see how to raise your hand, just unmute yourself. And
Stuart.
Hi. I'd like you to, well, firstly, I'd like to comment on asymmetric nature of cyber war, in that we in the West are far more vulnerable than because we are much more connected. We depend on IT systems far more, and such, so the asymmetry of the attack, if they attack a banking system, we're going to suffer far more than they will. That and the other thing, which I think is sort of tied to this, is I believe we've already had the first battle, which was the Trump and Brexit elections, where we contemplate, we don't know who attacked us. We suffered majorly in the West from those events, and they have succeeded. There's no way we can any retribution available. I'd like your comments on the asymmetry and that type of attack.
I have very little to add. You're absolutely right. Asymmetry means that we're never going to engage in tit for tat, that whatever non-armed conflict retribution, the alliance, let's say NATO alliance, because I think we're both speaking from countries which belong to the NATO alliance. So let's use that as a shorthand. So whatever the members of the NATO alliance decide to engage in, it will never be tit for tat. It will never be qualitatively identical to the methods used against us. And you're right, the asymmetry is also it's also a measure of our globalized economies. And there's no doubt that what used to be a strength, seen as a strength, the interdependence of economies is now being weaponized against us. So, supply chain threats work because we've relied on just-in-time supply chains. So yeah, absolutely. I really have nothing to comment. It's very, very true. It's one of the elements of cyber warfare. It's asymmetrical. And it really changes the rules of a game, because you're not discussing only nation states. You have non-state actors.
Yeah, and a consequence of asymmetry is that we should be spending our money on cyber defense, not cyber attack, because that's the most effective way. And at the moment, we're not. We have the NSA and the CIA and GCHQ all hoarding vulnerabilities and using them to attack, as weapons. And we should be doing the opposite. We should be fixing, using those resources to fix things and make ourselves more secure. Resilience, absolutely. And I was very impressed to see just yesterday, I just spotted the UK initiative
let me fish it out for you, early warning system. And I've been banging on this topic for a couple of years now. I've spoken on this topic a couple more times, and I said, well, this is unfair. You know, the corporate sector is asked to withstand, to be resilient against military-grade cyber attacks with none of the military funding or you know, assets. And the message is, you know, it's landing. So this early warning, you sign up. I'm sure you've heard about it, but in case you missed it, you sign up, and the government, the UK government, will share with you in confidence whether or not your network has been compromised, or whether there's malicious activity in information feeds in your confidence, and you can investigate. But it will share with you information that is not available to the public, and before you actually are forced to you know, declare you've been breached. So early warning is a fantastic initiative from the UK government.
I see Ugo, Chris and David have their videos on. I'll get to you. David, you had your hand up, so over to you.
Thanks for the talk. A couple of questions, I guess. One is, I mean, you mentioned international law throughout this, but how different states treat international law is quite variable. Some states are quite happy to disregard it because there is no international police force. There's no actual way of enforcing the law on a state if they don't want you to, unless you're prepared to actually do it by force. So I'm just wondering if
what's the point?
How that's going to sit. I mean, a lot of the actors that are mentioned, the APTs, are actually states that will set aside international law when it suits them. You know, for example, Russia, China, North Korea.
Yes, I get that question very often. What's the point of invoking international law if it's a sort of honesty box? You know, you enforce it if you want to enforce it yourself, but nobody can compel you to. It is you know, the characteristic feature of the international legal system. It's a horizontal legal system. It's absolutely, you know, it's been designed after the Second World War. It represents the state of play then at that point in time of the Allied victory after Second World War. So what if? It's always a good question, and there's never a good answer. The point is that there's friction. If you break international law, there's a lot of friction. There's a lot of political friction for you as a state. There's a lot of political friction for you as a government. It's never painless. So yes, you might say there's states in which that friction, public opinion, isn't really there to give the government a hard time for breaking international law. But there are, of course, you know, it bleeds into politics, it bleeds into international relations, and it's easier to coalesce against a state or an actor if it has broken international law than if you had nothing at all to point to. So it's not a very good answer, but that's the answer I have for you, I'm afraid, Stuart. And yes, absolutely, it's.
No, I appreciate that. I used to work at the United Nations, so I come from a background of seeing how, I mean, seeing the confusion where people expect international agreements to somehow be magically enforceable, but it's too often demonstrated if a state doesn't want them enforced, there's nothing you can really do if they're willing to accept the friction or have other tools to do that. So you see it cutting across domains enormously. It's like, well, you know, you're attacking us. Well, in warfare, well, you're attacking us, so we're actually going to cut off state aid to all your friends.
Yeah.
And they're going to scream at you and ask you
But
to
also,
stop.
don't forget the international law has got a long memory, and when the dynamics of power shift, then there is such a thing as international tribunals, and they do have consequences. So of course, you know, it might take 20, 30 years. It might take 20, 30 years, and it might not go the way you wanted, but there is...
yeah, some of my colleagues have
there are consequences.
some of those at the moment. Well, the other thing that struck with talking through it, a lot of the actual weaponry is actually in the hands of private actors.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say they can be used by states, but essentially, I suppose you'd say there's a lot of mercenaries out there.
Yep. And
in some arenas, the mercenaries dominate.
Yep.
So it's very different from traditional warfare and that. And from everything you say, I suspect states will find some quite different ways of retaliating. They will have to innovate.
Yep.
Yes.
I've learned a new term which I hadn't met before, and it's cyber buccaneer. I think that's glorious. Thanks for that.
But yeah, in the moment we've been quite fortunate that most cyber attacks don't really have what you call very public, visible harm. And people don't tend to treat data losses and things as harm. But if it did go a step further, and you can with some of the attacks that have been attempted on power stations and things, they can actually result in actual bodily harm to the civilian population. Yeah. It puts a state in a very difficult position. Yeah. And how do you retaliate? And as you mentioned earlier, does that tip it to the point where they could say, well, fine, we're just going to send a group of specialists in to go and kill the hackers, because that's you've actually harmed our civilian population. So yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. It's very, very interesting.
If you're interested in continuing this, I'm happy to share resources and feeds. And there's a couple of books and a Journal of International Warfare that's been going on for 20 years, and a couple of key articles I'm happy to share. Just connect. You and I are already connected, David, on LinkedIn, but anybody else who wants to say hi, I'll connect and share happily.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, David. Ugo, you've got your hand up. Over to you.
Hello, Ugo.
Hi, Chiara. Thank you very much for a very an informative evening. And that was quite interesting. Yes, I'm definitely going to link up with you. I'm quite interested in that topic. I'm just interested in to hear more about the collaboration amongst countries.
Okay.
Things are definitely difficult in relation of monitoring all this cyber warfare.
Yeah.
Most of these attacks will happen. You don't know where they're coming from.
Right.
However, do you agree that with time, because we are aware that there's this warfare brewing at the moment, that most of these countries should actually come together and collaborate instead of waiting until it happens or things start to blow up?
Collaborating doing what? Would you say collaborating in resilience or collaborating in attacking?
No, not attacking,
okay.
In resilience mainly.
Yes.
And also in putting some key laws or in place within each country. So what I'm saying now is, if let's say like NATO, that's a body that already exists.
Yeah.
If within the countries that make up NATO, we start to put within their own countries those laws preventing people from acting or attacking or using cyber warfare against any other state, that will diminish or reduce most of these attacks. And while that is going on, can't you see the possibility of these countries then working together to make sure that the level of resilience kind of improves greatly in a shorter time. I believe, you know, day in, day out, we find new improvement in technology. Yeah. I'm sure within the next few years or a couple, you know, maybe a few months even, there'll be a new technology that will be able to, you know, do something better than what we can handle now. Yep. So I'm looking at the possibility of that collaboration happening, improving the resilience within, you know, across nations, and also reducing the number of attacks that happen from any country. Because if you know, within Britain, you're going to be, you know, you're going to fall foul against a particular law that says you cannot attack any country from this country. Obviously, there will be something monitoring within the country to find people that will fall foul of those laws, and that means in general there'll be a reduction of such things happening in the first place. So for those countries that will not sign to that agreement, then you know that most of your monitoring systems will focus on them mainly, because there's a likelihood that things will be coming from those countries that are not part of the treaty.
Okay. I see what. Yes, that's a very, very good point. So if you compel signing up to, you know, if you compel nation states to sign up to obligations to implement a certain resilience program, for example, you already know that those that don't sign up to it are suspect, are at the very least they've got something to hide. Yes, that's absolutely, correct. Absolutely. And this is beyond existing alliances. You're talking correct. About something beyond NATO, something new, something bigger.
That's correct, because what I'm looking at is, you know, you cannot just wait or sit on your hands and wait until something happens. We already know that it's happening now, but it's not reached that level where things cannot be you know, corrected. So, you know, we're talking about, okay, World War III is going to be cyber warfare. So we have already lived a time. We've already lived at a time when we have World War I, World War II, and nothing good came out of it. So we shouldn't then wait until World War III happens and destroy whatever we've lived for and implemented all these years. We should be working towards making sure that doesn't happen. And the way I say it is that collaboration of nation states coming together to actually sign on the dotted line, and we will make sure, it's like a promise, we will make sure that World War III does not happen, and then working together towards it.
Yeah, I kind of agree, strongly agree. I suppose the difficulty is the unknown quantity of cyber warfare, isn't it? Yeah. Because even if you focus on cyber resilience of your networks, and is that other thing, other thing that's on top of the 5 known domains of operation that is throwing a spanner in the works. Mm-hmm. So it's deepfakes, you know, it's deepfakes tilting the balance of elections, or is misinformation about the efficacy of vaccines. I mean, these things really were not really in the literature 3 or 4 years ago, in the military That's literature, correct. But now are first front of mind for military theory. It's information warfare and disinformation. It's the new thing on the cybrid playbook. And the weaponization of personal protective equipment supply chain. Nobody had thought about that 2 years ago. And now there's a country that, you know, the European Union is looking at strategic autonomy in that respect. Everybody else is looking at their supply chains on protective equipment and preparedness for pandemics. That is the unknown quantity of the cyber threats, and it keeps changing, it keeps moving, and it will be added on top of the others, because one, you know, it will not be only the new unknown thing that That's will it will be on top of land, air, sea, space, etc. So it's yeah. But I think you'll see that NATO countries are very serious about cyber resilience. I'm happy to send you references. And as far as I can tell, it's front of mind for every nation state. It's been now sort of drilled down and funded properly. I think the next frontier is healthcare. Yeah. Healthcare is becoming a key strategic defense priority. I agree with you. And states that have traditionally cut healthcare budgets are looking at pandemic preparedness in a new light, and linking up with the Ministry of Defense on it, because it's become another facet of this. That's right. Well, I see a future, I think it's the very near future, where artificial intelligence and machine learning will play a vital role in curbing a lot of things, because we as humans cannot really do everything, but at least with the understanding and knowledge of machine learning, for instance, we can, within a given time, try and put things in place to help us tackle most of these problems. Absolutely. And you'll know that another area of great activity in legal terms is regulating the export of dual-use technology, and AI falls into that. But everything can be dual-use technology, and so the big new headache now is, how do you actually regulate the export of that? What else can you think of as dual-use technology or dual-use items, dual-use goods? That's right. But yeah, it's very alarming, and I don't think anybody can afford to be innocent about what's happening. Even if you look at data protection professionals like myself, you just can't say, "Oh, another data breach." It's not. Wake up! It's more than that. Bigger than that. It's more than that. Yeah. I thank you very much. I'm grateful.
Talking a lot about resilience and needing to be more proactive, and rather than just waiting things to happen, like you were saying there, Ugo. But in your talk, Chiara, you were saying nation states cannot have a preemptive defense. It sounds like that needs, and Stuart was saying, need to be focusing on, if I understood you correctly, Stuart, preemptive defense, rather than trying to find vulnerabilities that one can attack. I'm trying to wrestle with
preemptive self-defense. Sorry, I was trying to define the use of force in preemptive self-defense, not the use of cyber resilience. That's absolutely fine. Okay. But in case that's probably the misunderstanding, because of course even the NATO has form in creating cyber weapons and directing cyber attacks. I think there's been a realignment of the risk, the risk-benefit equation, and I think resilience is winning the day.
Yeah, thank you for that.
As far as I can tell, there's less focus on producing cyber weapons for attack purposes, although of course research continues, and rightly so. It's important to signal capabilities even if you don't use them.
Yeah, no, that's much clearer, thank you. David has helpfully shared NATO's June 2021 communique in the chat. You might like to follow that through.
Yeah, let me cut and paste that. Yeah,
26 mentions of cyber in there. So thank you for that, David. I don't see any more raised hands. Do we have any more questions?
Well,
Andrew, as our chair, would you like to wrap up for us, or you're very welcome to do that?
Yes, when I can persuade my microphone to unmute. Yes, so that was very interesting. Thank you very much, Chiara. And as Mike's just said, all that remains now, I think, is to wrap up. Thank you all for attending, and we'll hope to see you at the next event, which I